Have you noticed that a lot of people who grew up in the 80s seem unable to ask for help even when they're drowning? And how this shows up in their relationships, their careers, and their mental health today? Why did so many people from this generation learn that needing someone else feels like failure? To understand this, we need to look at what was happening in America during that decade. Think about it. For the first time in American history, both parents were working full-time in massive numbers, and there often wasn't a family support structure to fill the gap. Divorce rates had skyrocketed to nearly 50%. The nuclear family as Americans knew it was fracturing, and a lot of kids were caught in the middle of this social experiment. Many kids came home from school alone, with their house key hanging around their neck on a string or chain, and this became a defining image of that era, the so-called Latchkey Kids. While other generations might have had a parent waiting at home with snacks and homework help, a lot of these kids had an empty house, a note on the fridge, and maybe a TV dinner in the freezer. And the most obvious thing to think is that this probably taught independence and self-reliance. Maybe there's some truth to that. But there's often a darker side to this story. For many people, the result was learning they couldn't really count on anyone. That key hanging around your neck wasn't just a symbol of freedom, it might have been a warning, and that warning felt simple. You're on your own. A lot of kids learn to make their own meals, manage their own time, deal with their own fears when the house made strange noises at night. They learn to handle emergencies alone, to solve problems without asking, to never be a burden because everyone around them seemed too busy or too stressed to handle one more thing. And this leads to a hard question. If you learned at 7 years old that asking for help meant bothering someone who is already overwhelmed, how do you learn to be vulnerable with a partner at 37? To understand this, you need to know that parents in the 80s weren't just physically absent during work hours. Even when parents came home, many of them were exhausted, stressed, emotionally checked out. The body was there, but the presence often wasn't. Dinner might have happened in front of the TV instead of at a table. Conversations might have been about logistics, not feelings. A lot of kids learned that emotional needs were inconvenient, that their problems were small compared to adult problems, and the best thing they could do was stay quiet and handle things themselves. And you might think you learned resilience and strength from all this, but that's not always the full picture. What often happened is people learned emotional self-sufficiency that borders on isolation. It wasn't always healthy independence that was learned. Sometimes it was hyper-independence. This deep belief that needing someone is weakness, that relying on anyone will inevitably lead to disappointment. Many people internalize that vulnerability is dangerous, that asking for support means you failed somehow, and this tends to show up in subtle ways. You might struggle to delegate work because you don't trust anyone to do it right. You might stay in relationships where you're giving everything but receiving nothing because asking for more feels impossible. You might handle every crisis alone, even when people offer to help, because accepting that help feels like admitting defeat. But where does this fear of depending on others come from? A big part of the answer lies in what many parents lived through back then. The 80s saw the rise of the work hard, play hard mentality in America. Reaganomics promised prosperity through individual achievement and corporate success. A lot of parents were trying to provide the material comfort they didn't have growing up, and many paid for it with their time, their presence, and their mental health. They worked longer hours, climbed corporate ladders, believed the promise that financial success would create family security. But what many kids received were the things, not the people. They got Nintendo and name-brand sneakers and after-school activities, but they often didn't get consistent emotional attunement or secure attachment. And there's often a similar pattern today, this idea that working harder and achieving more will finally create the security and connection you're looking for. But that's not always the whole truth. What might really be happening is a kind of inherited emotional self-reliance trauma. Many people watch their parents disappear into work and stress, and this can get internalized as the belief that connection isn't reliable, that people will always choose something else over you, that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. There's often an attempt to control everything in your environment so you never have to be in that vulnerable position of needing someone who might not show up. Today, you might be the friend who never asks for help but is always there for others, and feels secretly resentful that no one seems to care about your struggles. But when someone tries to show up for you, you minimize your problems or change the subject because accepting care feels unbearable. And there's one last piece that often completes this puzzle. What messages did you receive about emotions themselves? To close the circle, the 80s saw the peak of tough love parenting philosophy in America. Many children were told that crying was for babies, that emotions were manipulative, that the world didn't care about your feelings, so you better toughen up. "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about" became a common phrase in many households. Showing emotion might have resulted in mockery, punishment, or being ignored. Many children learned that feelings were problems to be solved or weaknesses to be hidden, not experiences to be understood and processed. You might have come home upset about something at school and been told to deal with it, or life's not fair, or knew other kids whose parents responded to emotional distress with impatience or dismissal. Many children learned that emotional needs weren't just inconvenient, they were character flaws that needed to be overcome through willpower alone. And you might think you learned not to be overly dramatic or needy, but it's often not quite that simple. The truth is many people learn to view their own emotional needs with contempt. There's a tendency to feel disgusted with yourself when you're struggling, to berate yourself for not being stronger, for not being able to just push through it. And this often isn't weakness or self-pity, it can be learned abandonment programming. You might avoid therapy even when you're clearly suffering because admitting you need help feels like proof that you're broken. Or you might go to therapy but struggle to actually be honest about what's really happening because vulnerability with another person triggers every alarm system in your body. You might have incredibly high standards for yourself and zero tolerance for your own struggles, treating yourself with a harshness that would horrify you if you heard someone talking that way to a child. And this often isn't a choice you're making consciously. It's how your nervous system learned to protect you from the shame of having needs that might not be met. But here's the thing, there's usually a way out of this. You didn't choose to be this way. Many people were programmed, and their brains created these defense mechanisms when they were 6 or 7 years old, navigating an environment where emotional needs felt dangerous. And they often worked, to some extent, in that context. Being self-sufficient kept you safe when the adults around you couldn't consistently provide emotional support. But today, these same strategies might be keeping you isolated, preventing intimacy, and making you carry burdens that were never meant to be carried alone. If you recognized yourself in this, understand, your self-sufficiency saved you when you were a child, but it might be suffocating you now that you're an adult. It's time to thank that armor and start taking it off. You can start changing this in a few ways. First, try practicing asking for small things. Next time you're at a friend's house and they offer you a drink, say yes instead of saying you're fine. When a coworker asks if you need help with a project, pause and ask yourself, is saying no actually protecting me, or is it protecting that scared kid who learned that needing help was dangerous? Start with low-stakes requests to slowly teach your nervous system that accepting support doesn't lead to abandonment or shame. Second, practice noticing when you're struggling and saying it out loud. You don't have to solve it or minimize it or explain it away. Just practice saying, "I'm having a hard time" to someone you trust. You might be surprised to find that the catastrophe you feared doesn't happen. Most people actually want to show up for you. They've just learned not to offer because you always say you're fine. Third, ask yourself, what would I tell a 7-year-old version of myself who is going through what I'm going through right now? Would I tell that child they were weak for struggling? Would I tell them to just handle it alone? You might notice that the compassion you have for others or for your younger self is completely absent when it comes to your adult struggles, and this gap often reveals the learned self-abandonment you're still carrying. Keep in mind that you're not alone in this. A lot of people are going through similar patterns of hyper-independence and difficulty accepting support. And if you found yourself wondering why you feel lonely even when surrounded by people, this tends to be common for those who learned early that emotional needs were burdens. The answer often isn't to keep proving you don't need anyone. It's actually to start building relationships where interdependence is possible. Asking for help isn't weakness. Needing people isn't failure. Having emotions isn't a character flaw that needs to be overcome. Recognizing that you might carry this inherited self-reliance trauma isn't making excuses or playing victim. It's often the first step towards building the connected, supported life that scared kid with the key around their neck desperately needed but never got. Your past shaped your survival strategies, but it doesn't have to script your entire future. If you want more videos about how childhood experiences shape our adult relationship with connection and vulnerability, drop a comment and subscribe, and together we'll keep exploring what's really driving our emotional patterns.